On this show, we feature Chris McAuley. And we're back with magical people and my very special guest, Chris McAuley. How are you this day, Chris?
I'm doing well, Dr. Mike. How are you?
Thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank you infinite amounts of times because, as I've mentioned to you, a lot of people may not know this, but I'm a huge fan of Dracula. I'm a huge fan of that whole Gothic thing. I believe I was six or younger when I was introduced to Famous Monsters of Filmland, the Universal Monster series, and Dracula in particular, and something just resonated for me. I maybe it's a past life. I don't know what the heck it is. And bats fascinated me. I have still this innate love of bats, which is really a lot of viewers may not know. It's not a major part of the whole Dracula thing because there's rats and there's moon dust. He travels on as moon dust along a moonbeam or something. There's smoke. There's wolves. Bats are not the only creature, but he's most associated with that because of popular media and of the day. Most people know the Bela Lugosi incarnation of Dracula. And although the accent is actually, in a way, it's pretty accurate to what we're talking about, because Transylvania is, first of all, is not a town, it's a region. A lot of lay people may not know that, but he was born, I believe, near there, Bela Lugosi, and so his accent is probably the only accurate thing in that whole production. And when I looked at, after I knew a lot of details about the whole Dracula realm, I looked at the Dracula film. I believe it was 1931, and the stage production. I believe it was in New York. I could be wrong. And they switched things around, and it still to this day annoys me to no end. The Renfield character, rather than being this mad character that eats flies, etc., turns out to be the guy at the beginning that comes to the castle in the Bella version to sign that Carfax Abbey agreement. And it's like, wait a second, that might explain later why he's gone mad, but that's not who it was. It was Jonathan Harker. And they've also switched around Mina and Lucy in that film as well. And I thought, wait, isn't Lucy supposed to be blonde and Mina supposed to be dark haired? Anyway, it's still, for lay people, it's a success. It'll always be a success. Bela will always be kind of the Dracula, but not in my book. In my, so to speak, in my book, it's well, for visuals, it's Christopher Lee of the Hammer films with his mustache, and John Carradine, David Carradine's dad, also with his mustache, very lean, with that intense energy. Let's start off by talking about this because of besides, I know you call him Dacre Stoker. I call him Dacre Stoker, probably not
after
right.
After the drink.
Yes, exactly. And aside from him, he is the great grandnephew of Bram Stoker, the original novelist. You're probably one of the few people that physically walk this earth that know Dracula inside out. So let's throw around some stuff. Let's throw around some theories. You even said to me, you suspect that the real Dracula, contrary to popular belief, may not be Vlad the Impaler, but maybe someone from the Lyceum Theater. So
Yes.
let's just get into that and chat.
Okay, so Bram Stoker did not originally title the novel Dracula.
Okay.
The original character of Dracula was known as Count de Vil. Now, the reason for that is that Bram intended that Dracula be the devil on earth. So Count de Vil, Count Devil.
Very good.
The publisher, Archibald the Constable in England, just said to him, right, we need to catch a title. We need one word. Go and find that one word. And he goes into the London Library and he starts to research. So he looks at books written by Emily Gerard about Transylvanian superstitions, picks up a book on Transylvanian history, bang, sees Dracula and said, that'll be a perfect name for the character. Now, this explains why whenever Jonathan Harker meets Dracula, Dracula has a very belabored backstory about how he's linked to gypsies and all sorts of characters, because there was no clearly defined historical figure that was being used. So a lot of Dracula scholars are like, oh, okay, so where's this all come from? Well, this is where it comes from, folks. It wasn't originally Vlad III. That was popularized by Ford Coppola's film. And he added an awful lot on. When it says Bram Stoker's Dracula, I have a massive problem with that. Decker and I hate that term. We call it Coppola's Dracula. The Bram Stoker film in the 90s has got very little to do with the book. But the visuals are gorgeous. And, you know, Dracula has manifested in various forms throughout the 125 years of his existence and many different interpretations. I like the film, but it's not Bram Stoker's original vision.
Yes, yes. And there were a number of other things as well. I know this was done, and it's not kosher. I can say that I'm Jewish. It's not kosher what the 1922 F.W. Murnau version of, they basically plagiarized their interpretation of the Dracula legend. And there was also a redone version in the 1970s as well. And it portrayed this bald-headed, long-nailed, long-fingered kind of character, but they never, because of copyright reasons, never used the name Dracula, never used the names of any of the characters or probably locations. And the symbolism, though, and the photography, oh my goodness, that struck me when I was a little bit older. I looked at it, and I've got a few captures as well that may or may not come up. um, there's a shadow of his hand, and the sleeping Lucy or Mina, I don't know which one, they refer to her as a different character anyway in that film, and the shadow of the hand over her heart kind of clenching it. And there's another visual as well, oh, of the rats, almost suggesting that he's a plague. The plague has come over from wherever now to England, or again, they've changed it in that particular film. So they're kind of portraying him or his like as a plague. And I thought that was effectively done with those rats.
Yeah.
And a further visual which grabbed me as well, not the one where he sits up erect as if he probably was tied to a board. Not that, but the sunlight one, where he opens up the sunlight, and that probably for the day or the belief system represented God, quote unquote, conquering evil, or light conquering shadow and darkness. And I thought those metaphors and that symbology was really, really cool. But I'm not so sure that's what the original novel at the core was about. How do you feel about all that? I've just spewed all.
Yeah, I'll just, no, you're fine. I can tell the enthusiasm and it's welcome. I'll go back to who the character of Dracula might have been historically. So Bram Stoker was the manager of the Lyceum Theatre in London, very prestigious theatre. He was also the manager of Sir Henry Irving, who was the first knighted actor. Henry Irving may have been the template for Dracula in real life. He liked to play narcissistic characters. He was instrumental in the creation of Dracula when he played Mephistopheles in Faust. Bram was very influenced by that. Also, the fact that he was when they were doing the stage rehearsal of Dracula, stage reading, and this is for copyright reasons, he was Dracula. Bram gave him the script and said, "You read Dracula." And so he read Dracula, and he was very much a method actor as well. One of the things that might interest your listeners is that Bram stated until his dying day that Dracula was a true story.
Yes. Yes.
So that always fascinated me when I saw that, with the notes and the letters. I was like, okay, this is absolutely fascinating. And he passed that over to the publisher, Archibald and Constable. And they basically said, no, we can't have this. Now, the book that you hold in your hand, you know, as Dracula, is not the full version, and we'll get into that later. It was redacted by the editors. But Bram stated that every single character, their names were changed, but they were real people.
Yes.
Postulation.
Now, I just want to emphasize to folks out there, you're not necessarily suggesting that Henry Irving was a vampire, but perhaps the character,
yes,
the literary character of Dracula was
based around. For the record, I don't believe in vampires. I just get that out there because some people ask me that, and it's like, no, I don't. Sorry, but there are different types of psychological vampires.
Yes,
and he may have had some of those traits. Bram's relationship with Irving became very strained later in their life. So that's where the historical Dracula may have actually come from the theatres. When it comes to Count Orlok and Nosferatu, the word Nosferatu was created by Emily Gerard, and it was kind of a made-up name, to be honest. It has no real meaning. She made it up in her book Land Beyond the Forest, which is the Latin name for Transylvania, and that was kind of lifted by Bram and used and now popularized. I love Nosferatu. I think it's extremely close to the Gothic vision of Dracula. Vampires are always popular during plagues. Two types of monsters are always popular: zombies and vampires during plagues. And the last great vampire scare was in Europe in the 70s, and it was straight after a plague. In fact, it was in a town in Romania, and some of the body of an old man was exhumed, burnt, and every um, person in the village had to drink part of his ash with water.
Hmm.
It's as recent as that, vampire scares. We also have the Highgate vampire scare in London, which is quite well known. But that's every time there's a plague, there's always some sort of popularist sort of vampire thing that comes out.
So
It,
what is it? What is it about the vampire thing? Because honestly, I can't stand zombies. I've researched down to their origins and that sort of thing, and how they were portrayed a certain way in movies in the 30s, perhaps, and to what they've become nowadays. Werewolves, I can take them or leave them. That sounds really weird, but it's true. And the whole like lycanthropy thing. I suspect, and I'd love your feedback, that maybe the whole fascination with vampires is the mystical, the sexual, the romantic, the darkness, the magic that is associated with the vampire, even though, strictly speaking, they're animals, they're predators. They're there solely to gratify themselves, and I'm not saying this literally. I'm not saying that vampires actually exist, except for perhaps energetic vampires and all that sort of thing, as you alluded to earlier. But strictly speaking, they are monsters. But somehow there's this association, maybe because of popular media, don't know, with magic. There's Lugosi's hand, and with mesmerism and mysticism and all that sort of thing. So for me, there's a depth to vampires and that whole thing. Werewolves, not so much, although I'm a fan of Lon Chaney. I realize there's been many other portrayals of werewolves other than him, Lon Chaney Jr. But what is it then? What is it where everything has veered off so much from, I think it's 1500s book. Was it Varney the Vampire?
yeah.
Spelled my favorite way, to modern day stuff. By modern day, I'm remembering the 70s movie with Sutherland and these kind of punkish kind of boys walking around broad daylight in pretty neat garb, modern garb, and I love the sunglasses. But look how much a broad range of deviation has occurred. What is it? What is the, if you'll pardon the pun, the enduring, long-lasting qualities of the vampire and Dracula in particular?
it's a popular conception of ancient religion. So we always have the concepts of blood sacrifice. They've been with us since the dawn of time. Even in Judeo-Christian religion, it's there. No matter how many times we try and deny it, it's all there, and that's part of it. I mean, Leviticus talks about why you should never consume blood. So the concept of blood sacrifice is there. It's an ancient part of religion. I think vampirism is directly linked to part of our DNA, if you want to call it, that remembers a lot of our ritualistic behavior. It's got passed down, possibly genetically. And that's why religion endures. Now, when you talk about the sun, for example, the sun was always an important part of human religion. In Neolithic man, bodies were turned to the east and painted red before they were buried. If you go to a Christian church, you'll see the altar is always in the east. Graveyards are generally facing the east. And there's a reason for that. It's to do with the sun. The cross is a symbol of the equinox of the sun. When Christ dies, and I don't want to be too controversial, but remember, a spear goes through his heart, pierces his heart to kill him, and then blood flows, and then the sun disappears. There's a lot of that symbolism and those religious connotations that have been put into vampirism, and it's part of a story that isn't allowed to die for whatever reason.
Yeah.
I point to Superman in this as well. That Superman is the sun god. Superman is powered by the sun. He's born of it's almost a virgin birth whenever he appears, and parents adopt him. They're not his true parents. His true parents are out there somewhere.
Yes.
And he's got all these powers, and you see it in Superman Returns film, where Lex Luthor pierces him through the side with a kryptonite spear, and he falls down in a cruciform. It's that Christic solar deity. Vampires are the absolute opposite of that solar deity. They embody darkness, and a quite soulless nature. And I think, going in psychologically to it, I think that's the shadow self. I think that's why vampires are attractive as well, because they're part of the shadow self. Um, you know, so yeah, there's what I think about it.
Very good. So enduring, the whole, what I'll say, the whole Dracula thing, and the mysticism and the glamour and all of that versus the origins of the legend, of the superstition, of the whatever. What's exciting, what excited me was a few years ago, I can't remember if it seems like 5 years ago, more or less, yet another republishing of Bram Stoker's original novel Dracula came out with a beautiful yellow cover and I believe red type, and all this. It was very simple. It probably was a reproduction of one of the original. You'll know this and you'll share this with us all in a few minutes. Probably was the a copy or reproduction of the original cover. And then what excited me, almost parallel to this, was the release of one or two other books. And one suggesting that it was the sequel to Dracula. And I thought, whoa, this is going to have to be really, really good to be a sequel. And oh my goodness, it was really, really good. It wasn't, how do I put this? It wasn't subtle like Bram Stoker's version. It was very specific, and a lot of the scenes were very explicit and specific and whatnot. But I'm not going to give anything away because people have to read this book. I believe it's called The Undead, Dracula the Undead. Perhaps you'll correct me or not in a few minutes. And for me, without giving too much away, I'm glad how the Dracula character turned out at the end. We'll just kind of put it that way. And for me, it was worth the journey of reading, such a long novel. I tend to read very quickly and write very quickly as well. So it didn't take me that long, perhaps just a few days. And then another book, I believe it's called Dracul. That's how I would say it as a Montrealer. Perhaps a Canadian would say, or an American might pronounce it differently. But I would say Dracul, D-R-A, without Dracula, without the A at the end, portends to be not the sequel, the pre-Dracula, the prequel, not the sequel, if you will. And for me, it chillingly resonated a truth. To me, that's one of the few horror novels that felt like, you know what? You never know. You never know. And so would you care to share a little bit of feedback with those books? And
Sure.
I'm aware of Dracula's Guest, which perhaps we should bring up as well in all of this, but just blab away and share, because I'm excited about all of these.
Yeah, I didn't write those books. That was Decker that wrote those books, but we have talked about them at length. Dracula the Undead, I read personally. There was a little bit of a disconnect I found between the original and that book, but it is a good read. It is very explicit, so if you're easily offended, don't read it. The prequel, Dracul, was very well received. I enjoyed it. It does bring up sort of a mystery about Bram Stoker. Yes, he was extremely ill as a child, and there was a mysterious nanny called Nanny Crone. And we do believe that Nanny Crone maybe started to share some Celtic folklore, because the Dracula vampire has more in common with Celtic folklore than it does with Eastern European superstition.
Yes.
You know, even the word Dracula in Irish means bad blood. You know, it might be a coincidence, who knows? But there are older forms of vampirism within Ireland, such as the vampires that come out of the bog, and you see that displayed in the book. Um, there was a vampire called Abertach, and he was a diminutive magician who terrorized an Irish village, and the tribe killed him, and he came back from the dead and then demanded blood as a tribute. This went on for an amount of time until the chieftain and several warriors killed him, and then they buried him upside down in an ash tree. That tree's there today. The farmer has kept that tree in the field. Successive farmers for the last millennia cannot get rid of that tree. They have tried everything. There's so many stories where, you know, recently even the farmer has come with a tractor and put a rope around the tree and tried to pull it. And before he could get the rope on the tractor drives off mysteriously on its own. They've tried to cut the tree down with a chainsaw stops working as soon as it touches the tree. All sorts of stories like this, because the legend is if you dig up the tree, the vampire will return. I've never been to the field, but I intend to go there whenever I return back home just to see. But I won't be attempting to dig the tree up. So the other aspect of vampirism, which is linked to Irish Celtic mythology, is that of the Fae folk, the fairies. And there was a battle between a race called the Fomorians and the Fae folk. And the Fomorians came from the sea and couldn't be killed. They had to have their heads cut off and a stake driven through their heart before they were killed. So you can start to see where Bram Stoker's taking a lot of his mythology from.
Absolutely. Well, he himself, I don't know if people out there know, Bram Stoker was Irish.
Yeah, proud Irishman like me. So yeah, there's a lot of correlation between Bram's work as well. You know, not just Dracula. I'm a professor at the University of Alberta, and I've got a tenure of a year to talk about Bram Stoker. I talk about the wide range of Bram's works, which we'll maybe get into later. And you know, he didn't just do Dracula. And I always say to my students, just because Dracula is the most well-known book doesn't mean it's his best book. That's quite controversial, but he was a poet. He was a painter. He's actually created the Dublin Illustrator and Painter Society. He wrote fantasy stories. He wrote dramas. Yes, he wrote Gothic horror and he wrote cosmic horror, but he had a tremendous range. He was the Neil Gaiman of the day. That's how I always typify him. And he was able to take all of the stories that I believe he was told from childhood and meld that into some very compelling narratives.
Yes, yes. I want to kind of go to a prequel, an actual prequel, if you will, because we are speaking of multiple works of his, and a very little known work of his is called Dracula's Guest, which I seem to remember, and you and I discussed this at another time, I believe was taken out of the original novel. Am I correct?
Yeah, it was taken out of the original novel. It was originally in there as a form of prequel, and it's a great book. If you go to YouTube and you look up Stoker McAuley Productions, Declan and I do a reading of Dracula's Guest together. We did it for last year's World Dracula Day. And we see Jonathan Harker going to the castle. It's an aspect of Jonathan Harker going to the castle. And he encounters a grave, which is his first encounter with a vampire, a female vampire. And then Dracula appears in wolf form and protects him. And yeah, it was released after Bram's death. By Florence, his widow, and yeah, it's not very well known, which is unfortunate, but it's part of the Dracula puzzle.
Yes. Yes. I was fortunate enough to read it when I was very young. I must have been 10 or 11. I got a hold of a paperback version. It was a very well illustrated comic book version of the original Dracula, but also Dracula's guest as part of other short stories, if you will. And that really grabbed me because there was an ominous energy, an ominous vibe present, if you will, um, uh, pretty much present during that whole story. And I never forgot it. And then I think years later, maybe just a few years ago, I decided to read the Amazon version. I think it was a Kindle version, and it moved me in other ways. That's all I can say. I'm a cat person. I don't know if we can give away parts of the book and explain what goes on, but I felt really sad. But I realized too there was metaphors involving a mama cat and a baby cat. Did you want to
Oh
go
yes,
there?
you're talking about Squall now. So you're talking about the. Yeah, we can maybe go there. I've got a little slideshow if we want to do that first,
Sure, that would
which
be awesome. Yes.
might start to. So forgive me, viewers, if this takes me a little while to get set up. Usually my wife's here to help me, but I will. You can let me. You can let me know if you
Okay, I
see
might
this.
blab along until we're ready, and then you could just
Right.
tell
Go
me
ahead.
when we're ready. So
Yeah.
the whole Dracula thing, oh my goodness. I was so excited to meet Chris. Our connection was magic, and probably the next show, because believe it or not, viewers and listeners out there, there's going to be a two-parter. Check this out.
So hopefully everybody can see this little title screen. Can you see it
Yep.
okay? Michael? Yeah.
Yep.
So yeah, this is a Stoker first. So this is something that Decker and I have created. This is a universe which is based on Bram's work, and we've got the famous quote here: "Enter freely, go safely, and leave something of the happiness you bring." Bram Stoker was a Freemason. This is very similar to a Masonic phrase. Bram Stoker was actually intrinsically involved in magic as well, as we'll talk about later. So let's see. So what is the Stokerverse? So basically we call it transmedia products. We've got comic books, we've got audios, we've got novels, we've got games that are all coming out this year. And there's a central focus on the story of Dracula. And we've got different genres as well. Much like Bram worked in fantasy and drama and all sorts of genres, we branched out into that as well. So, we've got very detailed characters and interpersonal narratives. And we believe that for fans of horror, vampire, popular entertainment, they've been looking for something like this for decades. So hopefully now the hunger can be satisfied. I never like talking about myself, but I'm always required to. So this is a little bit about me. Yeah, I mean, I've worked on the Terminator games, Judge Dredd. I've written audios, all sorts of things. So well, that's me. And here's the man himself. So Dagger's the co-creator of the Stokerverse. He's the great grandnephew of Bram Stoker. As we talked about, he's the international best-selling co-author of Dracula Undead and of Dracul. He's a lecturer on Bram Stoker, presents documentaries on Dracula, and leads tours to Ireland, UK, and Romania. And we have our friend Andrew Brown, who's the games manager. So we've got a few games coming out this year in the Stokerverse. So Bram Stoker, writer, Freemason, occultist, and theatre manager. I actually I love that image. Now we've got the Christopher Lee image there. But I always think that Bram Stoker was a romantic at heart, and hence that quotation about no one but a woman can help a man when he is in trouble with the heart. I think that gets really to the essence of Bram's writing. Very interesting history. He was born in Clontarf in Dublin in 1847. He was very ill during childhood. He couldn't stand or walk until he was about 7. And he made this miraculous recovery. He became an athlete and a rugby player and a football player. I think people thought he was going to die at one stage when he was younger. But yeah, made a full recovery. He worked in the civil service, always wanted to be a writer. And he started his career in theatre with the Dublin Evening Mail by being a drama critic. As we mentioned before, he became a friend, manager, and mentor to Sir Henry Irving. And the one important thing for me to note is that he wrote late in life. So if you're watching this and you've always wanted to be a writer, do it. Doesn't matter what age you are. If you're in your 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, or even your hundreds, become a writer. We've got Bram here, who's been writing, who wrote Late in Life and really made his mark in literary history. Again, didn't just write horror, but also wrote drama and fantasy. And one of the most interesting curios is that he helped Buffalo Bill with his Wild West show in America. So not a lot of people know. So as mentioned before, Bram doesn't just do Dracula. We've got a whole lot of works here that people may or may not be familiar with. So we've got Snake's Pass, we've got Jewel of Seven Stars. I love that cover for Jewel of Seven Stars. Lair of White Worm, and then Bram Stoker's Famous Impostors. So it's just a few selections of my favourites. So Snake's Pass is actually a romance novel. But an Englishman that goes to the west of Ireland. He falls in love with a woman. Father is in debt to a moneylender. Terrible thing to be. And they go and find a mysterious treasure in a bog. So you can see this whole thing about a bog and vampires and all of that sort of stuff resonating again. And it was his first breakout piece of fiction. Jewel of Seven Stars is an Egyptian horror story. And it's one of the first stories that's been written about resurrecting mummies. So we have this really now famous trope that's been used in Hollywood that Bram started, much like Dracula. And like Dracula, it uses instances of modern day science. So that's a common theme in Stoker's work. So they talk about radium for energy in it. Dracula, you have a phonograph where Seward is recording things. You also have electric lighting in Dracula as well. Jewel of Seven Stars was influential in cinema. So we've got the Mummy series, for example. And something very prevalent in Bram's works, strong female characterization, which is very important. Lair of White Worm, we've got ancient cosmic horror in a similar vein to Lovecraft. And it's based on folklore surrounding the Lambton worm. Probably should be spelled W-Y-R-M. But it's a long snake-like dragon. And it was published when Bram was in his deathbed, pretty much in 1911. The artwork was by Pamela Coleman Smith. And take note of that name. Pamela Coleman Smith was one of the artists in A. Waite's tarot cards. She was also a designer for the Lyceum Theatre. And the story infers that the giant white worm can transform into a very beautiful, sexy woman. Ken Russell did a film in the 80s called Lair of White Worm. It's okay. It's not the book, but it's okay. And it's worth a watch, but it does contain some of the elements of the book. And it was his early aspirations into the field of cosmic horror, which unfortunately were never fully realized. This may interest you, Michael. Famous Impostors has a whole lot of occult interest in there. So it's a non-fiction book which focuses on pretenders. And we've got chapters on practitioners of magic. So Paracelsus, Cagliostro, Mesmer. We've also got chapters on witches, John Dee and Ed McAuley. Worth checking out for anybody who's interested in magic. And of course we have Dracula. Now, I started delving into how Dracula may have been created by Bram Stoker. And I created an audio drama. Would you like to hear that audio drama?
Absolutely.
It's 5 minutes, and it is voiced by Kirsten Holland, who's an award-winning vocalist. So I think this is the first time it's ever been aired. So wow. You're getting a bit of an exclusive. So hopefully this works.
Awesome. Thank you.
A Whisper in the Darkness by Chris McAuley and Dacra Stoker. Performed by Kristen Holland. The leather armchair was comfortable. It seemed well suited to embrace his frame, the rich burgundy contrasting with his conventional dark blue suit. The light of the fire played across his handsome features, warm hues reaching up to caress his face for brief moments of time. His fingers were curved around the glass of brandy, which also helped to keep the damp cold of the Irish winter from his bones. This time of Samhain he held in special regard, a time where the twilight of the world began to recede into a slow, gentle embrace of darkness, a time where spirits of the dead flitted back to life, some pausing to remake their acquaintance, old school friends lost to tragedy, family members whose faces were summoned to brief remembrance in his mind. A spark flew out of the open fireplace. He shifted out of the chair quickly. Florence would be angry if anything stained her beloved rug. It had been gifted to her by a close cousin just before she fell pregnant. As he bent down to ensure that the spark would not ignite the sheepskin, he heard another voice. The intonation was slightly accented, and its strength undeniable. It was the whisper in the darkness that he had been hoping to hear. Bram, it will soon be time to breathe me into existence. Even with his proximity to the flickering flames, a familiar chill seemed to surround him. The accent brought with it a sense of unhappy days from his childhood past. As he stood, steadying himself with the heavy mantle of the fireplace, the months of sickness which plagued him were brought to mind. Weak and unable to join the outside world, it had marked him, separated him from possible friendships, from play and from laughter. As isolating as his childhood had been, it had also gifted him with an inquiring mind and an imagination that very few could equal. The voice reminded him of Ellen Crone, the mysterious lady with the ever-changing aspect, a face which flitted between the young and the old, a source of wisdom and then even a source of comfort. In moments where his whole body seemed to rebel against the notion of taking one more breath, she had been there. She had ensured his survival. Hazy memories of rich red lips and impossibly sharp teeth shining in the darkness began to assert themselves. Again, the voice spoke. My story will redefine the meaning of terror. Through your words, I will travel across the east of Europe to England, and my name will also be known in the new world of America. Bram settled back into his armchair, his mind full of visions of an imposing castle, wolves baying at a full-crested moon, and a young man imprisoned, his soul in danger of damnation. This was the beginnings of the story which the voice had always promised him. Since the days confined to his bed, afraid to go outside, this voice and the promise of a great story that was to be told through him had always skirted the edge of his consciousness. Lately, however, the voice had become manifest. These rich, cultured and accented tones were the reason that he stayed up late at night, The paper-thin wall between the living and the dead being torn asunder seemed to inspire and fire his imagination. He was seeking a crowning glory, a Gothic novel to rival that of Poe and of dear Oscar. Unseen by Bram from the darkness behind his armchair, a deep darkness where the crackling fire could not illuminate, slender, powerful hands, wraith-like in their appearance, began to settle on his shoulders. The fingernails protruded in a fashion which gave them the appearance of claws. Some dirt was present under them, as if the owner had recently dug their way from the ground. As the ghostly fingertips pressed against Bram's shoulders, he felt a chill like no other enter his body. From his head, travelling down through his spine, a gnawing cold which could never be sought to be warmed invaded him. Once again, a swathe of images danced in front of his eyes. Women and men joined in a desperate fight against evil. A count from remote Eastern Europe, stretching his hands through the forces of history to reach England. Dead bodies animating and being brought to life. Madmen issuing words like prophets as they consumed insects. A lean face smiling in a rictus-like death grin, his mouth and face covered in blood. The yellow eyes gleaming evilly. All through these hellish visions, Bram felt as though someone was leaning over his shoulder. He could swear that he even heard the armchair creak a little. As the voice spoke for the final time that night, he felt a breath against his cheek. It brought with it an unwelcome intimacy, for he could also detect the sweet smell associated with the recently deceased. For those awful moments, he found that he could not move. When you tell them of me, it will cause men and women to check their doors and windows at night. Children will scream as they look out their windows and believe to see my face, smiling at them in the moonlight. My name will gift you immortality, and the legacy as no one else on earth can share. Through your words, nations will once again tremble at the name of Dracula. The hands and the voice left him. Bram once again found movement in his limbs. As he looked for reassurance in the bright light and heat of the fire, he reached for his notebook, resting on the table in front of him. He began to write.
So hopefully that came across quite well. That is a little bit of an explicit for you.
Awesome.
No
So appreciated, Chris.
Reese heard that one before.
Yeah, we're going to have to wrap up, and surprise, surprise, we're going to go into part 2. So our viewers will have a lot more information to look at, and a lot more exciting things I also want to touch on in part 2, the 175th anniversary of the release of the novel by Bram Stoker Dracula. So thank you once again, Chris, for joining me this day.
Problems, enjoyed it.
And I want to thank all of you out there for joining us as well on Magical People. We'll see you for part 2. Don't go away.